HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Secrets of Story, Innovative Tools for Perfecting Your Fiction and Captivating Readers, by Matt Bird, read by Eric Michael Summerer. Preface. You've just boarded a plane. Your iPhone is loaded with all your favorite podcasts, but before you can get your earbuds in, disaster strikes. The guy in the next seat starts telling you all about something crazy that happened to him, in great detail. This guy is an unwelcome storyteller, trying to convince an extremely reluctant audience to care about his story. We all hate that guy, right? But any time you write a story for strangers, any kind of story, novel, memoir, screenplay, comic, even just a cover letter, you become that unwelcome storyteller, desperately trying to make a connection before those earbuds pop in. 21st century culture moves fast, and there's an endless amount of content bombarding us at all times. What are the new rules for succeeding as a writer in this oversaturated environment? The answer is simple. If you want to write for strangers, you have to remember what it feels like to be that jaded audience. When that guy next to you starts talking, do you just assume he's got a good story to tell? No, you don't. Do you automatically care about what he has to say? Certainly not. But wait, could you ever possibly care? Yes, but only if he swiftly wins you over. How quickly do you want that chatty passenger's story to become interesting? Right away. Do you want him to start with a lot of background information about where he was born and what childhood traumas he had? No, you want him to skip over all that. Do you want him to tell you about a bunch of unrelated things that happened this week? No, you want him to tell you a focused story about one unique and interesting thing that happened to him. Do you want him to go on and on about what a pitiful, inactive, incapable failure he is? No. If you're going to care about him, he'd better be worth caring about. It's that simple. Tell the story that would win you over, even if you didn't want to hear it. This is the heart of the secrets of story. Of course, there are thousands of other writing guides, so what makes this one unique and uniquely necessary? The advice in this book is irreverent. Writers are snarky people, but too many writing books are burdened by a grandiosity and solemnity that seem totally alien to a writer's day-to-day experience. I love writing, and I'm in awe of great stories. But the best way to write those stories is to never lose your perspective or sense of humor. Comprehensive. Too many writing books fall into the category of, here are a few pointers I picked up over the course of my career. That's great if those pointers happen to be the ones you need right now, but these books offer no place to begin, and they make no attempt to systematically cover each step of the process. This book has a step-by-step, concept-by-concept approach that examines just about everything that goes into writing a great story. Practical. My focus is less on what does it all mean, and more on accumulating surgical instruments for specific situations you'll encounter. The hope is that the next time you're laboring over some poor patient and desperately hold out your hand for the next tool, it will be within reach. Consider me your operating room nurse. Counterintuitive. Too many books fill their pages with common sense or easy wisdom, confirming the certainties that readers brought with them. I try to limit myself to counterintuitive insights I never would have guessed when I started. This book strips away the easy assumptions that struggling writers fall prey to and replaces them with less than obvious solutions. Based on human nature. Why do stories from all over the world have so much in common with each other? Is it because the authors are all following the same rulebook? No, it's because they're all describing the same thing, human nature. Too many books say, this is the way you have to do it because Aristotle said so, or because Hollywood says so, or because a market analysis said so, etc. This book rejects all of that in favor of natural, organic rules. Focused on audience identification. And now we get to the big one. This is the essential quality of this book. I just can't find another book that puts the audience's satisfaction above your own or your professor's. If you really value your audience, you'll never have to choose between audience satisfaction and writing from the heart, because the two will be one and the same. You have to embrace your audience. They are the only reason to write anything, and once you start listening to what they need, your writing will improve by leaps and bounds. This is a book for anyone who tries to sell a narrative to a weary public. Novelists, screenwriters, playwrights, creative nonfiction writers, journalists, marketers, speechwriters, and resume writers. This book will show you how to create powerful audience identification, which is the heart of good storytelling. I'm gratified that this advice has been embraced by many types of writers over my years of online pontificating. In fact, my top followers have always been novelists. But I should warn you up front, I won't be able to hide very well that my background is in film and TV writing, so the majority of the examples I give are taken from those two media. I've found that this actually works best for all writers because movies and TV, more than novels and plays, are the cultural currency we all share. And when a novel is adapted for the screen, it's boiled down to its essence, and the essence of writing is what we're talking about here. Rest assured, I use these examples in universal ways, so the lessons drawn from them are applicable to all types of writing. So here we go. I hope this book will be for you what I wish I'd gotten when I started out: useful, illuminating, and most of all, fun. Part 1. Writing for Strangers. 1. George Clooney and Me. The CAA agent was getting excited. "Great! Do you think you could make these changes in 2 weeks?" "Of course," I responded, trying to sound healthy. I was excited, too, but I was worried about whether I could pull this off without having to reveal my little secret. After all, most of the people on this conference call didn't know about my diagnosis. A year earlier, I had graduated from Columbia University with an MFA in screenwriting. I had won some awards there, so I was part of a group that got flown to LA to meet with agents and managers. I wound up signing with a fantastic young go-getter who worked for one of the highest-profile managers in the country, and they both promised me big things. Soon afterward, I had been through a whirlwind of meetings with production companies, both in New York and Los Angeles, and now here I was on the phone with my manager, her boss, and the big-time agent they wanted to partner with on this project. They all loved my pitch for an hour-long period-piece spy show, and they wanted to set it up using the agent's deal at HBO. Unfortunately, throughout the whole round of meetings, I was getting sicker. At first, my doctors couldn't figure out why. By the time they finally detected the cancer, it had metastasized into multiple systems and spread to both halves of my body. That's called stage 4B. There is no stage 5. The only good news was it was Hodgkin's lymphoma. Though Hodgkin's is swiftly fatal without treatment, it responds to chemotherapy relatively well. Even though we'd caught mine very late, there was still a 75% chance it could be permanently beaten within a year. I just had to make it through that year without wrecking my career. When I told my industry friends about my diagnosis, they all said the same thing. "Don't tell your managers, they'll drop you." But I didn't have a lot of choice. If I didn't tell them, then someone else would. I was getting chemo every other Monday, and for a week afterward, I would stumble around semi-conscious from toxic shock. At first, I simply arranged to have my studio meetings on the off weeks so that nobody would notice. But then my hair started falling out, and I was losing weight. I couldn't keep it a secret for long. It was time to come clean. I called the manager who signed me and told her the truth, making sure to joke about the fact that everyone had said she'd drop me. She was aghast. "What a horrible thing to say! How could anybody think that? Of course we'll support you as you go through this." I told her how relieved I was. Then, without missing a beat, she said that we shouldn't tell her boss. "He's so excited by this new project, and we don't want him to lose interest." Okay. So now it was our secret. Luckily, the conference call was scheduled for the Friday at the end of my off week, so most of the chemicals were out of my system and I was feeling spry. I was ready for whatever they might throw at me. I'd sent in the pilot script a few weeks before. The purpose of the call was to get notes, which is always a nerve-wracking process. You're afraid you'll get hit with suggestions that make no sense whatsoever. It's a crapshoot. Will the note giver be a glad-handing boob who blundered into the business, or a thoughtful professional who really cares about the work? Fortunately, the CAA guy was great, and he gave me some of the best notes I've ever gotten. But, of course, the best notes are often the toughest. He loved the pilot, but he focused in like a laser on my greatest weakness: character creation. He said we needed all new introductions for every character. I needed to make each member of the ensemble pop right away. Luckily, he gave me a great example: George Clooney's introduction in the pilot for ER. A pediatrician stumbles into the hospital after a night of partying. His exasperated colleagues forcibly hook him up to a saline drip to get him sober, and he promptly falls asleep. When incoming patients jolt him awake, he leaps up and flies into action, saving lives. I instantly saw what the agent meant. That's the kind of introduction that lets you know right away that this is going to be a rich, deep character with 8 seasons of conflict built into his DNA. The CAA guy asked if I could come up with introductions that good for all of my characters in 2 weeks. It was a tall order, but I said I could do it. What I didn't say, of course, was that I was about to be pumped full of poison, and I wouldn't be able to start until that dose wore off. Oh, and there was one more problem. The effects of chemo were cumulative, so I was now recovering less and less every time. My off weeks were getting shorter. Still, my career momentum was on the line, so I told him it would be no problem. As we got off the phone, everybody engaged in some virtual backslapping, assuring each other this thing was going all the way to the top. That Monday, I got my dose. A week later, I was becoming lucid again. I tried to use my impending deadline to snap my mind back into line and start writing. But in the meantime, maybe I should take another nap. And so went the week. Whenever I could stay awake, I tried to force myself to come up with character introductions as good as Clooney's, and then berated myself when I couldn't. My professors and managers told me I was such a great writer, so why was this so hard? Why couldn't I do this? Why didn't I have these skills? Then Friday arrived, and I had nothing. As it happened, Friday was also the day I was supposed to get my blood tested to ensure I had recovered enough to prepare for the next batch of poison. I was reluctant to tear myself away from my writing desk, but I finally shambled over to the hospital. Once there, I asked my wonderfully maternal nurse, Joy, for a stat on the blood tests so I could get back to the writing as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, Joy ran my blood work and didn't like what she saw. Yes, my white blood cell count was high enough to prepare for the next round of chemo, but the rest of my levels were so low she couldn't believe I was able to stand. Joy ordered me to lie down for an hour of saline drip before I went home. As I lay there, the saline worked wonders. I started feeling better and thinking more clearly. Eventually, the humor of the situation occurred to me. I had been studying that ER intro so long that I'd started to live it. Just like Clooney, I leapt up afterward, rejuvenated. I went home and wrote all night. In the morning, I sent off 4 strong intro scenes to my managers and the CAA guy. I could only hope that they wouldn't respond with any immediate notes, since I was about to go out of commission again for another agonizing week. That was a few years ago. The good news is the chemo eventually worked, and it looks like the cancer's never coming back. The bad news is, like most projects, the TV show eventually stalled out. It's never died completely. In fact, it recently came back to life. But I've learned not to get too excited about these things. But what really stuck with me from this incident was the harrowing realization that, despite my pricey education and all that praise I'd racked up, I didn't actually know what I was doing. At all. When asked to write those introductions, I realized, to my horror, that no one had ever asked me to do anything like that before. I'd developed a lot of screenplays and TV scripts at Columbia, but most of the notes I'd received were about the work as a whole. The professors always wanted to talk about my ideas and introduce some even bigger ideas of their own. Never in a million years would they say, "Here's a popular TV show, write something as good as that." We were supposed to be better than the knuckle-draggers writing Hollywood movies or network TV. We were supposed to be artists. As a result, I had learned the art but not the craft. When push came to shove, I simply didn't have the necessary tools I needed to do the job. As bad as the cancer and chemo felt, this realization felt worse. I had just plunged myself, and my lovely new wife, into $150,000 worth of debt, only to discover I was totally unprepared for my profession. This was real trouble, and the chances of recovery were a lot less than 75%. The Poisonous Cinderella Story. Up until that week, I was still clinging to my personal version of the Cinderella story. I was convinced I could go to a top MFA program, impress my professors, get whisked into a job in the industry, start at the top by selling a show to HBO, and begin a life of fame, fortune, and acclaim. So far, everything had seemed to work out. CAA liked the new intros after all. But I began to feel a sense of dread. This was all an illusion. I didn't really have it yet. Looking back, this was the time I began to see that Columbia had been run like a fantasy camp. We were encouraged to dabble in everything and specialize in nothing, to follow our muse wherever it led us, content in the knowledge that we were in a safe space. We got tons of praise and very little criticism. In fact, there was only one guaranteed way to get chewed out. More than once, when I hesitantly proposed to fellow students that they may need to reconceive some aspect of a project, my professors would bring the class to an abrupt halt and tear into me. How dare I imply that there was a right way or a wrong way to write? Students were free to follow their pure, unadulterated visions, and nobody had any right to interfere in that process. Chastened, I would meekly reassure my fellow students that they should stick to their original vision, no matter what. That was the gospel. In the end, the message of my program could be summarized in 2 words: never compromise. Or to put it another way, never fix your story. Why did they insulate us from criticism? Why didn't they load us up with useful tools? Why didn't they teach us to satisfy an audience? I realized I had been scammed. They wanted us to feel as good as possible for as long as possible in order to get as much money out of us as they could. The way to do that was to assure us we were already geniuses. But could we blame them for that? After all, why were we really there? To get our asses kicked? To have cold water thrown on us? Of course not. We were paying them a fortune to tell us we were great and about to become creative royalty. We had enrolled ourselves in fantasy camp, and it was their job to sell us the fantasy. But it's not just MFA programs. Writers are plied with Cinderella stories from every direction, and particularly from book promoters. If a writer produces a hit after years of less successful books, as was the case with Suzanne Collins, then her personal story is downplayed. But if the writer has a hugely successful debut, as was the case with J.K. Rowling and Stephenie Meyer, then her story is constantly trumpeted. Audiences love Cinderella stories, and promoting an author's rags-to-riches ordeal will sell more books. The problem is, writers get fooled. We think instant success is the norm, not the exception. We expect million-dollar stories to appear to us in our dreams, fully formed, and all we have to do is write them down. This makes it painfully disappointing when we fail to achieve overnight success, and it also makes it hard to learn to write, because we think that great writers shouldn't need to learn. As I was finally coming down from my own Cinderella story, I noticed 2 different news reports that perfectly encapsulated the myth and the reality of making your first sale. The first was about a first-time novelist who bragged that 54 agents rejected his novel, but he stubbornly kept sending it out until the 55th took a chance on him and got it published. Press releases like this are very common, but they always leave out one huge detail. Was he revising his manuscript the whole time or not? These stories always imply that the early rejectors were abject fools who failed to see the author's inherent brilliance, but the author stuck to his guns and refused to listen to the naysayers. Finally, one brave agent and/or publisher saw the value that everybody else missed, proving the author had been right all along. But isn't there another possibility? Surely, by the time you've been rejected by 10 agents, much less 54, you should start eagerly listening to the naysayers, pumping them for notes, and rewriting your text to satisfy the most persistent objections. Isn't it possible that Agent 55 didn't prove the previous 54 wrong? What if that last agent proved the others right? Isn't it more likely those rejections provided the impetus the author needed to fix his manuscript? Why can't the press release be honest and admit that? I was gratified a few months later to read a far more humble and honest interview. Unlike the writer profiled in the earlier article, this novelist's debut book was a huge success, but this was no Cinderella story. Read how Catherine Stockett, author of The Help, describes what she went through in her attempts to get her book to market. By rejection number 45, I was truly neurotic. It was all I could think about: revising the book, making it better, getting an agent, getting it published. I insisted on rewriting the last chapter an hour before I was due at the hospital to give birth to my daughter. I would not go to the hospital until I'd typed the end. That's the reality of writing. It doesn't spring from your genius fully formed. You cobble it into shape with a lot of sweat and elbow grease. You take those rejections seriously and rewrite it over and over until you finally figure out how to overcome the most persistent objections. Writing is a process of trial and error, trial and error, trial and error. We can rebuild him. So there I was, reeling from my newfound realizations. My MFA program had left me without the skills I needed. It had also given me exactly the wrong attitude toward writing. It was time to reject every lofty theory I had been taught and learn the nuts and bolts of real writing. As I slowly recovered from the chemo, I started working on new and better manuscripts, but I also started a daily blog called Cockeyed Caravan. At first, it was just an excuse to re-watch and write about my favorite movies and TV shows, but then it became something else entirely. I was reapproaching these stories with new eyes, and I began to see many of the things I'd missed before. I had borrowed the name of the blog from one of my favorite old movies, Sullivan's Travels. Though I didn't realize it at the time, this quote presaged my growing realization of the importance of audience identification for writers. In the movie, Joel McCrea plays a pretentious Hollywood writer-director who refuses to make a studio assignment called Ants in Your Pants of 1939 until his studio releases his previous movie, a grim allegory for modern America called Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Of course, there would later be a real movie made with that title in tribute to this one. Everyone who sees McCrea's ponderous epic tells him that he just doesn't understand poverty. So he leaves all of his possessions behind and goes on the bum, riding the rails like a real hobo. Unfortunately, McCrea still can't entirely connect to his poor compatriots because he always knows that his butler is just a phone call away. It's only when he gets mugged and falsely arrested for murder that he comes to understand the true nature of poverty. His fellow chain gang members are not moved by his lofty rhetoric, but when they're shown silly cartoons on movie night, they finally rise above their miserable situation and feel human again for a moment. After McCrea manages to free himself, he happily signs up to direct the comedy, saying, "There's a lot to be said for making people laugh. Did you know that's all that some people have? It isn't much, but it's better than nothing in this cockeyed caravan." I gradually came to realize that there was a deeper resonance to my choice of a title. More and more, I was using the blog to create a new model of writing advice, one focused on satisfying an audience rather than merely satisfying yourself. With the help of many amazing blog commenters that became my collaborators, I picked apart my favorite stories and then put them back together, carefully cataloging what really made each one work. What I ended up with was a long list of counterintuitive realizations about storytelling that were entirely the opposite of what I'd been taught in school, and quite different from the advice in the most popular writing books as well. This was the true nature of story, which was hiding just below the surface. And so, once I fully recovered my health, I dived back into my career with what I'd learned in exile, and I've had far more financial success. Now I understand how to write those killer character introductions producers demand, how to invisibly structure like a pro, and how to make something meaningful. Meanwhile, unexpectedly, the advice took on a life of its own, which is what led to this book. With the invaluable contribution of my commenters, I ended up with a comprehensive list of incisive questions that provide new insight into every step of the writing process. Those questions will form the heart of this book, but before I get to them, I need to melt down your brain a little bit so that it'll be easier for me to reshape it according to my fiendish whims. Let's start with the 13 big game-changing breakthroughs that led to everything else. 2. The 13 Essential Laws of Writing for Strangers. Let me preface this by saying that I'm not claiming to be Edmund Hillary, reaching a peak that has never been glimpsed before. Hopefully, you're a lot smarter than me, and this stuff has always been perfectly obvious to you. Primarily, these laws are intended as a sort of antivenom. I use them to flush poison out of my veins, and I offer them up to you in case you need the same cure. You have to ask yourself why you're doing this. If you're only doing it to please yourself, then you're guaranteed to succeed and guaranteed to fail. I promise that you will eventually satisfy yourself, but your end product will never satisfy anybody else. You may think you're capable of holding yourself to a high standard, but that almost certainly isn't true. The problem is that you already know how to identify with yourself, so achieving self-satisfaction will be way too easy. What you don't know how to do is make strangers identify with the heroes you create. That's much harder and a much more ambitious goal. When you look at your manuscript, you see a shiny gem that you lovingly cut and polished. Strangers just see a pile of paper. Eventually, you realize it's not that gratifying to say, "I love my shiny gem." But it's very gratifying to say, "A stranger loves my pile of paper." The first is easy to achieve and therefore worthless. The second is extremely difficult, which makes it priceless. 1. You must write for an audience, not just yourself. This is the big one, and it's also the biggest hurdle for some writers. Many writers fear that if they try to write for an audience, they'll end up pandering or chasing the market. Indeed, both of those are bad, because the audience doesn't want to control your narrative. They want you to control their experience. They want you to set, upset, and reset their expectations. They'll never admit it, but they want you to masterfully manipulate their emotional experience every step of the way. Figuring out how to do that is the #1 goal for any writer. If you feel you have to choose between writing for an audience and writing from the heart, then you're in big trouble, because to become a great writer, the two must be the same thing. In the 1970s, Francis Ford Coppola turned out a remarkable string of masterpieces: The Godfather, The Conversation, The Godfather Part 2, Apocalypse Now, because he respected himself and his public at the same time. He wasn't chasing an audience, but was skillfully enticing them to chase after him. He didn't give his audience exactly what they wanted, but he did tune into their wavelength to find stories that resonated with them. But by the time Coppola got to the 90s, he had a total disconnect. He gave several interviews in which he explained that his goal was to make one for them, followed by one for me. But it was kind of hard to tell which was which, because none of his movies from that period, The Godfather Part 3, Bram Stoker's Dracula, The Rainmaker, Jack, were any good. As soon as you make the distinction, you've sabotaged yourself. Now, of course, you might be thinking, don't audiences get it wrong all the time? Don't they embrace crap? Why should I trust their taste more than my own? But this sort of antagonistic thinking will cripple your artistic growth.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?